Welcome, North Point family, to our Thursday video devotional. Today we are looking at the subject matter of perseverance. And to look at perseverance, I want us to consider 1 Corinthians 10, verse 13. No temptation has overtaken you that is not common to man. God is faithful, and he will not let you be tempted beyond your ability. But with the temptation, he will also provide the way of escape, that you may be able to endure it. I want us to consider two things from this passage as it relates to perseverance. And number one, that there is no kind of suffering that is unique to man. No kind of suffering that we are the object of, whether it be individually, corporately, nationally, or globally, as we see with the kind of suffering we are dealing with this virus. No kind of suffering that is not common to mankind as man lives this life under the sun in a fallen world. Isn't it true that when we are the objects of a particular kind of suffering, some horrific event in our lives, we tend to think that we are the only people in the world that has ever had to deal with that. We are sort of on this island all by ourselves, this island of suffering that no one in the world can possibly understand. And if we're honest with ourselves, we'll even say God can't understand. And what does that often do? It lends itself to this state in life of self-pity. It lends itself to the state in life of hopelessness, of faithlessness, and it keeps us from running that race that Paul calls every Christian to run. And what Paul is reminding us of here is that no matter what kind of suffering we deal with, it is not unique to us. We are not the first people in the history of the world to deal with a pandemic, and we will not be the last. And perhaps you're dealing with an individual kind of suffering. You are not the first person in the world that has ever had to deal with it. Whatever kind of suffering we have is common to mankind living under the sun in a fallen world. You know, it's interesting, counselors and therapists, what they will often say to someone who has dealt with a severe tragedy in their life, one of the first things they'll recommend is that they find a group of people that have dealt with the same tragedy. Because it's just having people in the same room that you know have dealt with the same thing you've dealt with is an encouragement to you. Even if they don't have necessarily a magic bullet answer to get you through, oftentimes they don't. Oftentimes it's just them listening. And it's the knowledge that the one listening to you has dealt with the very same thing you've dealt with. And that's an encouragement for people. It's an encouragement for them to press on. And that's what Paul is telling us as we run the race of the Christian life, as we deal with sufferings and trials in this life. Never think that you are on this island of suffering all by yourself. The game of suffering is not an individual sport. It is a team sport. And we have teammates, Christian brothers and sisters, in the past, in the present, and in the future that can be an encouragement to us as we face the sufferings that are common to man, living in a fallen world. Second, there is no temptation, and there is no kind of suffering that can overcome us where God does not provide a means of escape. There is no kind of suffering that will ever enter our lives where we will be so boxed in by darkness that there will never be a glimmer of light, that there will not be an exit door in sight. God will always bring suffering where there is a means of escape, where it will not completely destroy us, where it will not take us into a state of utter hopelessness. And did you notice what Paul ties this to, this fact that there is always a means of escape in our suffering? He starts that statement by saying God is faithful. God is faithful. I don't know about you, but when I think of God's faithfulness in my suffering, I think of his faithfulness once it enters into my suffering. In other words, I enter into some sort of suffering, some kind of suffering brought on by circumstances in life. And it's then that I go to certain passages in Scripture that speaks of God's sustaining grace and his sustaining power to uphold me and to help me to persevere. And certainly we see God's faithfulness is used in that way. He is faithful to us in the midst of whatever difficulties we're dealing with. But what Paul is saying here is something a little different. God's faithfulness is not only tied to how God sustains you in the midst of your suffering, God's faithfulness is tied to how he will sovereignly place suffering into your life. In other words, Paul sees God as the one that holds the circumstances in his hands that he places into your life that brings suffering. And his faithfulness is seen in that he will never sovereignly place a situation into your life that will completely overwhelm you and shut out any hope that is ours in and through Jesus Christ. So we see God's faithfulness not only in the midst of our suffering, but his faithfulness as the one who holds the very circumstances in his sovereign hands that he brings our way. And he will never allow a circumstance to enter into the lives of his saints that will overwhelm them, that will destroy them, that will destroy the hope of the gospel and the light of Christ that has overcome the darkness. So as we are dealing with, yes, certainly unprecedented times, as we deal with this coronavirus, let us not think that we are the first people in the world, the first Christians in the world that have ever had to deal with a pandemic. You read your history book for 5 minutes, you're going to see that that's not true. We have a plethora of saints, both in the past, we have saints now in the present, and we will have saints in the future that can come alongside us and give us words of encouragement as we deal with this unprecedented time. And second, let us be reminded that God is faithful, that God will not bring circumstances into our lives that will utterly crush us, because he has seen fit to crush his Son at the cross rather than us, so that in and through his Son, all the circumstances that bring sufferings in our lives are used to sanctify us, to make us look more and more and more like Jesus Christ, that light that has overcome the darkness. I hope you all are doing well, and I continue to pray for each and every one of you, and pray that you will continue to persevere in this current trial that the Lord has placed before us. God bless.